Hello and welcome to Carte Blanche, the show where candid conversation takes center stage about New York City and state. I'm Leila Logizico, I'm your host. Tonight we are going to talk about a pressing and critical issue for New York City, housing and homelessness. In the city that never sleeps, where dreams are born and fortunes are made, it is easy to forget that 84,000 of our fellow New Yorkers don't have a place to call home. Tonight, we're joined by an expert who has dedicated her entire career to this very complex and difficult issue. Joining us tonight is Mary Brosnahan, the former president and CEO of the Coalition for the Homeless. Mary joined the coalition in 1989 and was at the helm for 30 years. Mary has been named one of the most powerful women in New York City by the New York Post. And it's been told that if compassion was an industry, she would be its CEO. So stay with us as our show gives Mary carte blanche to talk about housing and homelessness. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Leila. It's great to be here.
So housing has been a very, very pressing issue in New York City. The affordability is really, going crazy, unaffordable. Mm-hmm. What's going on?
Well, I think for me, one of the stories of the past year that jumped out at me was a report in the Times just a few months ago that 80% of people who live in New York can't afford to cover their rent as well as their other basic needs. And I think that should stop people in their tracks. Many factors leading into it, but at the end of the day, since 2017, we've lost tens of thousands of units that rent below $1,500 a month, and we've added very expensive units.
So what I find really puzzling is exactly that. It's like, the net number of units seems to actually be steady or even increasing a little bit. But what we see, and we have seen that in Midtown very acutely, the large rental buildings that were probably naturally occurring affordable units are taken over by developers, they're demolished, and then they're replaced by super tall towers.
Right.
We've seen that on Billionaires Row. We've seen that on in Hudson Yards. Mm-hmm. How do you explain the fact that, if you and I are able to make this observation, it's fair to say that our elected officials also are. Where's the policy to counter that?
Right. Well, unfortunately for so many of our elected leaders, many of their biggest donors, their highest donors, are real estate developers. And so you have this phenomenon that you've described, which is in plain sight. I mean, anyone who walks into Central Park can look out at Billionaires Row in the evening. I did so recently with my son. And you see one or two lights or one floor of lights on. This isn't housing. This is basically a vertical safety deposit box where foreigners are parking their money to have a safe harbor to grow their assets. Well, the rest of us, the more quiet disaster that's happening, and it happened recently and has gained traction in slow motion, was what we had, vacancy decontrol. So just to give you my personal example, living in a relatively small building, when I moved in, the entire building was rent stabilized. Now there's only 3 of us left. People have either died or moved away, and if the super could raise the rent over a certain threshold, that unit became destabilized. You have these dual crises. You have the luxury high end, which gets so much attention, and then you have this steady degradation of the common housing stock, so to speak.
Yeah. So, what I find really bizarre is that, there is this narrative that is pushed very hard that we have an issue of supply and demand. And, as much as, of course, supply and demand is part of the economics of housing, it is much more complex than that, yes. Right? And what really determines the cost of any housing unit is really the cost of the land.
Yes.
We live, certainly in Manhattan, in the most expensive area in the country. Mm-hmm. And some would argue, maybe the world, maybe pockets of London and Tokyo may be on par. But, the island of Manhattan is, the priciest land per square foot. And what we have seen in Manhattan very clearly is that buildings get demolished and then they get replaced, at times by buildings that are denser, and all it does is actually increase the price.
That's right.
So, a neighborhood that used to be affordable, then all of a sudden, as soon as this lender-developer dynamic comes in place, basically has this rippling effect, not of, like the trickle-down housing stock that increases, that, some argue would get the prices down. It has the exact opposite effect. How do we get out of this funk?
Well, this is probably the most troubling aspect of this whole situation, and why, after having worked on homelessness now, trying to work on upstream what the factors are that are creating homelessness. There's a terrific book out. It's called Homelessness as a Housing Problem. And two really smart professors out in Portland did brilliant analysis and basically proving exactly what you just said, that it's sort of the Gold Coast cities where we see the most homelessness, because it's the places where we have the least affordable housing and rents are highest. What's concerning is that people fall back into this very simplistic thinking of supply and demand. Or if you want to do the heavy lifting and you go back and even read Adam Smith, he held housing out of this very simplistic, that's his brand, supply and demand. But what we've seen...
even he knew that
yes, and
these economics don't apply to housing.
They don't. And exactly what you said, that if you have the land and people hang on to that land, what they want to do is to build the most dense. And we can also get into just sort of what happened during and after the Depression and the federal investment in affordable housing. And when that was withdrawn, now we're relying increasingly on public-private partnerships, where just a pittance of the rentals wind up in the hands of people that need them most.
Yeah.
And the market is not going to solve this dire crisis.
Yeah, there's something that I find puzzling in this narrative, that if you increase the supply, then the prices are going to come down.
The supply of everything.
Usually,
of housing.
when housing prices come down, we don't call this housing prices coming down. We call it a housing crisis, right?
Right.
And we never let prices come down.
Right.
And even in China, that is actually going through a tremendous housing crisis, prices are not coming down.
Right.
Which
it's rigged that way.
So, at what point are we going to be able to push for a different narrative and different policy, so that we are actually able to bring the prices down?
Well, I can only tell you from my perspective sort of what played out around homelessness. When homelessness first emerged, obviously the people on the front line wanted to give people help, get them off the streets, do this sort of emergency intervention, but we weren't investing as a community in housing-based solutions. And because it didn't seem to bring the numbers down, there's sort of a cynicism that's arisen around homelessness and housing. So people really give up hope that there's any solution. And as it relates to housing writ large, we really need to examine places where there's been tremendous success, places like Vienna and other places where there's dramatically financialization of housing. What we have going on right now are people are using housing, and who can blame them, as their primary wealth investment vehicle. For many people, it's their only real asset. And trying to have that shift in mind and say, rather than put all your eggs in that housing, why don't we, as rich people do, have a fraction of our investment in the housing, build housing for what it should be, for shelter, and not have it be driven and flipped constantly. It's this flipping that goes on. It's really kind of a cynical pyramid scheme, and that's what we need to get out of. I think the only way we're going to do that is by engendering hope in an alternate system.
So it's interesting that you referred to Vienna because it is really the poster child for affordable housing. Where Vienna was really smart is that they actually acquired a lot of land.
In a time of crisis.
The government, and whether it was at the state level or at the city level or at the county level doesn't matter, but it was public money creating public housing. New York has had its share of success with Penn South, for example, with Mitchell-Lama programs, which, Penn South is a sort of version of it, with, what people now call community land trusts, which, is a sort of catch-all phrase for different formats, but basically it keeps the equity with the land or with the public entity, and it works. When is our next Mitchell-Lama getting built?
Well, that's, I would say, the $64,000 question, but it's the multi-billion-dollar question. Because right now what we have are these billionaire real estate developers trying to figure out, I don't think that this was a Warren Buffett expression about trying to do short-term investment, whether the bird will fly this way or that way off the branch. They're trying to decide what the next thing is that will bring them money. They double down on office space, and now realizing that we've had this revolution due to COVID in our society, so suddenly lots of office space that's become virtually worthless. I feel like if you look at the history of Vienna post-World War I, hyperinflation, a very unstable situation, and the city-state leaders at that time were very canny, and they snapped up huge swaths of property, and with this vision in mind that it would be beautiful, that it would be lasting, that it would be integrated. And Vienna is continually ranked #1 in the most livable cities in the entire world. So we know it works. It's just that saying to people, look, this can work, that it's not going to just be ghettoization or something cordoned off.
On public housing, NYCHA announced in August that now the cost of fixing all these buildings has risen from 40 billion with a B, to 80 billion. And they have made it very clear that their path forward is going to be, once again, the coined public-private partnership, which is really privatizing public housing. And it's certainly the project that is under review currently in Chelsea would actually see the demolition of the 2 campuses, the consolidation of all the public housing into 3 buildings, where currently they are spread out into 11, which means that it will free up immense amount of land that will be redeveloped at market rate,
right,
with a little bit of affordable housing. But once again, at what level of affordability, that remains to be seen.
Well, this is what's so problematic, whether you're talking about on the federal level or state or local level. It seems like we keep reinventing the wheel. And again, just speaking from my experience at the coalition, back when the city was dotted with vacant lots and the city was literally giving them for $1 to nonprofit organizations, we were using what's called low-income tax credits to develop those. And it really was like reinventing the wheel every time. Now we have this massive land grab through NYCHA. And I just want to say, it's easy to sort of pin this on, say, the Republicans or the Democrats, but what played out under the Clinton administration set the table for what's happening in Chelsea right now. Whereas when we came out of the Depression, people had the confidence that it should be locally managed, it should be locally envisioned, but that the federal government has a big role and that our tax dollars should go to affordable housing. It's really, I don't want to say life and death, but if you're talking about homelessness or housing, affordable housing in New York, it feels like those are the stakes right now.
Yeah.
Who's to blame? I think we all are to blame by not insisting that more of our tax dollars go to really high quality investment in giving people
do
a
you,
home.
do you feel that this discourse is forceful enough today to actually get the funding that
Do I
that
feel,
is?
I'm sorry,
Do you feel that the discourse
the discourse.
is
Yeah.
intense enough that we are getting the funding that we need? Because it sort of like looks maybe intriguing to do this public-private partnership, but at the same time, if the developer doesn't like maintaining these properties, he'll pack up and he'll leave.
Right.
And then what will these folks be left with?
Right.
Are they going to go back to NYCHA that doesn't have money to maintain their buildings?
Right. Well, it's interesting that you raise the word discourse, because the reason I'm here tonight is that I am such an admirer of what you did around Penn Station. And the fact, for folks that are watching, they may not be familiar with this, one of Kathy Hochul, our governor's top donors, Vernado, came to her, actually her predecessor, Andrew Cuomo, and had a horrific plan to build, was it 9 or 10?
10.
10 monstrous skyscrapers of office space, under the premise that somehow this was going to leverage money to fix horrible Penn Station, which badly needs fixing. Oh, and by the way, we're going to completely raise an entire city block of affordable housing in the process. And I wouldn't say you single-handedly, but you really lit the match and got that community rallied around, this is not equitable, this is not going to happen. And so the confluence of that and the fact that office space has become completely, I wouldn't say completely, but it has bottomed out in terms of its value. And so when I hear the word discourse, it's like, we sat through those meetings, those community board meetings, and it really reminded me of why I got involved in the first place. People are so passionate, and they know what's right and what's wrong. Those people who have lived, many of them elderly, as you know, on that block, and they were like, no way in hell am I leaving. So I think that people are very passionate and are looking for a place to direct that passion. I'm sorry, I'm being very long-winded here, but I'm very. I'm very passionate about this.
Do you feel that our elected officials are listening?
I think a handful are. I think most of them are not. There's just a report, and I didn't even have a chance to share it with you. Maybe you saw it in the Daily News today, about the electeds whose top donors were connected to Madison Square Garden. And it aligns very closely with all the electeds that sort of have been standing up defending the indefensible, which is James Dolan and his tax break scheme at Madison Square Garden. Yeah. So, I know we're not here to talk about Citizens United, but there's this centrifugal force of money that seems to be corrupting politicians on every level, local, and we have Kathy Hochul, and where's our elected leaders in Washington?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's really difficult to, what I find really very troubling is how, certain special interest groups are able to grab and frame the narrative, and then reframing the narrative becomes incredibly difficult.
Right, we can't be reactive.
No, exactly. And, I feel that with Penn Station, we were able, it took us a while to even get the story out. Once finally we managed to get the story out, then we were able to keep a hold of the narrative. And that was very important.
And it's still not over.
And it's still not over. It is still not over. And we need to continue to be extremely careful, because anything can happen, and we know also, we need to acknowledge that we lost the Hotel Pennsylvania. Yeah. Very historic building, really, a tragedy for New York. This hotel would have housed, literally thousands of migrants had it been standing.
Or native New Yorkers, for that matter.
Or native New Yorkers, for that matter. Absolutely. So let's pivot a little bit to the homelessness crisis, which has obviously a great overlap with housing, but not exact overlap. Tell us your experience with the Coalition for the Homeless. And how do you see homelessness today?
Well, you know, I was sort of radicalized a couple times in my youth. One, which seems kind of far astray, but really isn't, is when I was a teenager, my mother's family was from the Catholic ghettos in Belfast. And when I was 17, we went there for 6 weeks. And from a distance, I didn't understand it. I thought it was, you know, we all live here cheek and jowl across the country, Catholic, Protestant, like. And then it wasn't until I got there that I understood that this was economics and economic opportunity. And believe it or not, back then, at least in Northern Ireland, which was cordoned off by the British, you had to own a home to have a vote. So, you know, this seems like a very distant type of relic of the British Empire, but this is in the 1980s that people had to have home ownership in order to have a vote. And of course, the people that owned the property were by and large Protestant. So the majority of people were not being represented. Then you fast forward, when I lived in New York, it took me leaving New York to work on the '88 presidential campaign for several months and coming back for the full force of homelessness to hit me. And so, you know, working in it, going back to the battles between Ed Koch and there's a woman, Billy Boggs, who was mentally ill, that he wanted to have forcibly hospitalized, and sort of seeing that polarization of debate where you had Ed Koch screaming, lock her up, and you had the ACLU screaming, no, she just needs an apartment, always trying to have the sensible middle ground, like, no, she needs an apartment and services. And again, we just seem to not be able to get out of this ever spinning, revolving door of the mental health system. And the piece that's missing is obviously appropriate housing and services.
Let's talk a little bit about the way homeless individuals are handled by the city. So if I understand correctly, the city, allocates a budget to, deal with homelessness, but actually this budget is not administered directly by the city, but actually goes into the hands of private non-for-profits that run basically these programs, whether it is the shelters, the services.
If I can interrupt, the city does control the front door, and that's an important point.
Okay.
And the reason that it's important is we have the family system, and that battle has been won and fought many times over in terms of getting families placed quickly because those kids are missing out on school. I think that's not lost on anyone, the stakes for those folks. The front end, let's talk about the men's system. People still have to go through what we used to call Bellevue Men's Shelter. Now it's been rebranded as the 30th Street Men's Shelter, and are typically placed in very large facilities, many at places like Ward's Island and places that aren't accessible. And so who are the people that are preyed upon most in those type of chaotic large facilities are people who have either substance use disorders or people who have severe mental illness. I'm not suggesting that they rebuild an entire shelter system. It's in some ways just not a good use of money in the long run, but it does preserve life. And that was the intent when one of the coalition's founders, Bob Hayes, brought the lawsuit.
But at the same time, it looks like it's either you live on the streets or you're fortunate to be in, quote unquote, a good shelter. Mm-hmm. And what we see is, some shelters are actually run better than others. Mm-hmm. Based on the provider that is in charge.
For
so
sure.
As much as, I understand your point that, the city controls, the front door, but at the same time, the provider is going to have a tremendous impact. And some shelters are smaller than others, and I think that, scale matters. But it looks like, it's either you are on the street or you are in a shelter that everybody agrees is actually a really bad place to be. And there's nothing in between.
Right.
While at the same time, we know that it's actually much more economically practical
efficient,
and efficient to actually rent an apartment.
Right. Right, and one of the things that we saw during the pandemic when we needed to socially distance people is that we can do this. We did it with hotel rooms, but there is sort of a new model that's emerged. It's called a safe haven. And, you know, at the end of the day, homeless people are not that different from you and I. In fact, I don't think they're different at all. And that what they want is a door that locks. They want security, they want privacy, and the dignity that that imparts. And so you're not going to get that in a shelter. You have the providers, and you also have, where is this pipeline leading to? Yeah. And so the question that I keep returning to, and recently we had a report from the Manhattan DA who had an extra $9 million on his hand, and he decided that he was going to have a new team of outreach workers go out today. So one of the things I was hoping we could talk about is this model called Housing First, which is the idea that it's far more effective and cost efficient to engage people, regardless of how much distress they're in, and put them in housing, and then work with them to meet their goals, whether that's sobriety or getting a job or adhering to a medication regime. It's the gold standard, and we've gotten away from that in New York. And that's one of the things I was hoping we could discuss, and also we could get back to here in New York. It just makes sense on every level.
So, yeah, I mean, you look at the numbers, and it's just, you know, I mean, it is close to the most expensive way to house people, to put them in a shelter. Yes. You know, more expensive than to incarcerate them. That costs more, you know, to put people in prison, yes. But then close second is the you know, shelter housing. So why is that not getting more traction?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of the things that we talk about have very deep roots, and I don't know how far back. We don't have much time, but if you kind of go back, there's a great article that was written in the New Yorker called $1 Million Murray, and this is going back into the early 90s, and basically the author looked at, in Reno, I believe it was, the cost that it would take to this one gentleman who was what we would call a frequent flyer. He'd been in countless hospital emergency rooms and countless detox centers, etc. And he had figured up over the course of several years, it cost over $1 million to provide these emergency services. And so, again, this is putting it on the table. Why not put Murray in a housing unit and then have a very assiduous, very stepped up engagement from a social services team? And I think what it comes back to is people's sort of warped idea of fairness. In other words, I'm busting my hump. Why should somebody who's not able to get sober or somebody who's refusing to take psychiatric medication be put at the front of the line? And it goes back to the whole Calvinistic roots of right versus wrong, just versus unjust. But at the end of the day, I cling to practicality.
So pivoting a little bit, New York has been faced with, you know, unprecedented migrant crisis. Asylum seekers or, you know, being bused or flown into New York City at a rate that we have never experienced before, and there seems to be, you know, a lack of coordination between the mayor and the governor, and you know, calls for the federal government to step up that seem to be unheard by the president, and it seems really desperate with all sorts of measures that are being put in place, including tent cities on Randall's Island, and you know, I mean, you know, winter is coming. Right. How are we? You know, is it your opinion that the feds are actually not coming to New York's rescue in a way that is satisfactory? And then, you know, there are plenty of calls for, you know, doing away with right to shelter in New York City, whereas others are saying that it's actually up to the state to step up and institute right to shelter.
Sure.
How are we dealing with this issue?
Badly, in a word. I'm really glad you brought this up because When the founders of the coalition sued to establish the right to shelter, they sued the city and the state. They sued both the mayor and the governor. And both of those parties decided to settle that litigation in a consent decree. One thing I want to clear up, it's often characterized as a bed for anyone who asks for it. Not true. It's for people who, by either physical or psychological or social means, have not been able to secure housing, but also meet the means test for welfare. So, you can't just, I think Donald Trump, Michael Bloomberg actually made a point once that he could drive his limousine up to the front door of the shelter system. So this distorts the whole. But here's the point. Both the mayor and the governor were sued. And so it is a state right to shelter. And it would be very unfortunate if Kathy Hochul wants to learn that through, a tap dance in court.
So is that going to happen?
Well, what I'm hoping is that she will step up, and you forced her to step up on the Penn Station front. She needs to do something equally courageous on the right to shelter front, and she needs to, it's interesting from a political perspective, but I feel that both Adams and Hochul are missing a genuine opportunity to show real leadership and come together. If Kathy Hochul would open more sites in places that desperately need the migrant labor, and then have a strong, unified presence to go to Biden.
So two points on that. The first one, Adams says, well, it's very easy to, for all of you to give advice, but actually, governing is super hard, and we're really doing a terrific job. So that's good enough. And then the second point is, the governor feels that up until now, politically, it was advantageous for her not to touch it.
Right. Yeah, well, I used to think homelessness was the third rail of politics. Now I'm seeing homelessness and the migrant crisis as sort of a dual third rail coming together. There's no question there's blame to be leveled at every portion of government, but that doesn't do any good. What we can do is point towards solutions. And for Hochul definitely needs to open up more facilities outside of New York. But there's an undeniable role, and here's something that I will actually agree with Eric Adams on, is that Joe Biden has totally dropped the ball. And I think
why is that?
Well, I think he's trying to get past this upcoming election and not being seen as soft on migrants. Instead of leaning into what history has shown us is that waves of migrants have always preceded economic booms in our country. If you go back to the mid-1800s when the Irish came, big boom.
So, but isn't it also because maybe he doesn't want to tackle head-on, a reform of immigration policy?
Right.
Because, it's totally bonkers crazy to see that, some fields, for example, agriculture that depends heavily on a migrant workforce is actually forced to issue those temporary permits where, there's nothing temporary about the work that they're going to be doing. Year after year after year, peaches have to be picked and tomatoes and you name it.
Right.
So when are we going to get immigration reform?
Well, that's a huge issue. And I think people who know it well point to what can he do by executive order and what does he really need buy-in from the Republicans, which does not seem to be coming. I think by executive order, the low-hanging fruit, pardon the pun, is extending almost immediate work permits for the people who have arrived and are dying to work and pay taxes. That's something that both Adams and Kathy Hochul have been banging away at. I will say, to Hochul's credit, meeting most recently with the president's chief of staff, she did elicit a promise for more housing vouchers. That it took this level of a crisis for her to swivel her head away from her billionaire funding base, the real estate industry, and actually care about people who are just barely surviving speaks a lot. But credit where credit is due. Hopefully we'll be getting more housing vouchers. And this is exactly what the City Council has been trying to get Eric Adams to do, which is step up and create a genuine pipeline, not just for the migrants, but for every homeless New Yorker.
The thing, though, is that in New York City, it's almost impossible to find a unit that will take vouchers. I mean, the waiting list is crazy long.
Right.
So, unless the state does its share, I don't see how that is really going to alleviate, the immediate crisis.
Well, when you really get down, I hope you have Gail Brewer on your show, because she's like one of my heroes. She understands it's all in the details. It's all about who is on the other end of that phone, who is actually going to go to battle for these people.
Always.
And so, is it a problem? Yeah. But it need not be a catastrophe. It need not be no one is getting housed by this. It can work. We need the enforcement.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the time of the show where we talk about numbers. Okay. So this is the time of the show where we go into pole dancing. And pole dancing is all about talking about numbers, talking about poles.
A different type of pole.
A different type of pole dancing. So today we're talking about a poll that was commissioned by Data for Progress, and that shows that respondents in New York City favor social housing by 80%. And 66% of respondents believe that housing and affordable housing is the most important issue in New York City. So, Mary, what does this poll inspire you? And especially, this 80% of respondents that prioritize social housing. What do you make of that?
Well, that's the most optimistic number that I've heard in ages. Over the years, many times heard that housing sometimes even eclipses crime as affordable housing as the primary concern that people have in New York. But to hear that 80% would be supportive or are interested in social housing, it is really tremendous. And again, it shows you that at the end of the day, people are reasonable and they want to buy into something that's going to yield different results. When you actually visit a place that's working and well run, and it's not the profit is not the motive. Yep. It's about the shelter. It's about the community. It's not about people trying to flip and make money. Yep. It's a whole different vibe, and it's very exciting.
This is the path forward. So as we're getting close to the end of this show, I have prepared a little rapid fire questions for you, Mary.
Okay.
Hopefully you'll play the game with me.
Oh, absolutely.
All right. So I'm going to start the sentence and you are going to finish the sentence. Housing is a human right, but
most people have trouble buying into that.
You love New York, but
I wish it were more affordable for everyone.
Community engagement is critical, but
people have a million different priorities just making it to the next day, so we have to make sure that we go that extra mile to make it happen.
Yeah, no, that's very true. Public housing is underfunded, but
it need not be. That there is a solution to this, and it's worth every penny of investment to make it more beautiful, more affordable, and more lasting, more integrated into our community.
Yeah. New York mayors and governors are committed to solving housing affordability crisis, but
I've never heard that before. It's all in the campaign stuff speech, but after January 1st, it seems to evaporate. Sorry to end on a downer note.
One word of hope.
The hope is that I think that just going back to when Giuliani, for instance, the last time that the right to shelter was being attacked head on when he was trying to eliminate it, over 80% of New Yorkers rallied around it and believed that this was an important thing. I think that at the end of the day, everyone wants their neighbors to have a place to call home. Yeah. So I'm very hopeful about that.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say that, housing insecurity is something that is just so scary to all that, seeing anyone in this situation. It just resonates on such a personal level.
Yeah.
It's really tremendous.
If we don't harden our hearts, if we
Yeah.
can imagine that's us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Mary, this has been really fun
Yeah.
to do this this show. Thank you so much for being on Carte Blanche. Thank you for being the first guest.
Yeah, thank you for inviting
Being
me.
very
This
brave.
was wonderful. I'll recommend it to Gail and everyone else I think is worthy to be here.
Thank you. You know, I think it is important to have these candid conversations. You know, scripted comments, you know, we know where to find them. You know, prepackaged narrative, we know where to find them.
But this is what's missing.
Hopefully, many will agree. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for being with us tonight on Carte Blanche, the show where candid conversations take center stage. We were here with Mary Brosnahan to talk about housing and homelessness. Join us on Twitter, on Instagram, and on Facebook. Carte Blanche and Leila Logizico. I am your host, and I hope to see you next week. Good night.